Hey everybody, it's great to see you. Thank you all for coming out today. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you Katie Peterson, this year's winner of the UNT Rilke Prize. She won for this fantastic book, The Accounts. If you don't have your copy yet, you should get a copy. There will be copies for sale tonight at the reading, which you should also go to, which is at 8 o'clock over in the Business Leadership Building. So make sure you come and hear her there. But today she's going to talk to us for a bit about this book, about poetry in general. She also has 2 previous books, which I think will be for sale tonight as well, including Permission. And I have to say, Katie kind of confused us. Bruce Bond and I judged the prize this year. And she kind of confused us because 2 of her books were in the mix. And one of the requirements for this prize is that it's a book by someone who has written at least 2 previous books. Well, the 2 books that were in the mix this year, The Accounts and Permission, were either the second and third books, which is the way we chose to read it, or the second and third books, which we could have read it. But they came in together, and it turns out they were published almost exactly at the very same moment. And both of them made it really into our final round of consideration, which I think says a great deal about how terrific the work is that you're going to expect to hear today and hear about today. So let's, first of all, give a big round of applause to Katie. I don't know if you could tell, there's at least one person who wasn't fully clapping. Bruce Bond had a minor injury today. He was stung by a bee on the way, so he actually has a handful of ice. So we're watching him. We're going to make sure nothing, goes awry with it. So if you see him slump over at some point, you might say, hey, Corey, you might be good. So I'll watch out for that. Maybe I'll begin with a first question, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you, because I'm sure you have questions as well.
I'm going to stand up because I'm
Please.
short.
Yeah, I'm going to sit down, so then you can sit down.
Okay.
I wonder if you just talk to us about this book in particular, and writing this book, how it came together, and your sense of that process of structuring the book, especially because it seems like that book was coming together at least at the same time or overlapping somewhat with this other book that you were also working with. So I wonder if you could talk about The Accounts and what shapes that, but also kind of put it in the context of writing 2 books at once.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think the first story about writing The Accounts that I want to tell is actually not about my own poems, but about the poems of a guy named Thomas James. I wonder whether some of you have heard of. His poems were reissued by Grey Wolf in this. We're doing this thing where they reissued, lost poets, and Lucy Bruckberry did the introduction, and I actually really dislike the introduction, but some of the poems I found really amazing. And sometimes when I don't know what to do in writing, what I do is I take a poem and I try to write the opposite of the poem, word for word almost, or sentence for sentence. So if the poem says, the trees are green and full of leaves, I say the trees are brown and full of death, or whatever. I mean, this is a bad example, but you see where this could go. And I fell in love with Thomas James's style, and he has a poem about going into an emergency room. He's going into the emergency room. He's talking about the person who's leaving him behind. And I really fell in love more with the music of the poem in a way than with his music is almost... It's like treacly, gothy, like poetry was like Twilight, right? It's just so bloody, treacly. It's not really my music at all. But what I did is I rewrote this poem. And at the same time, I was having a recurring dream. I haven't had a lot of recurring dreams in my life, but I was having this recurring dream. And in the dream, I had killed a policeman and buried his body in an orchard. And in the dream, usually I'm in a house and I'm just cleaning up and it's my house. And I realize this all of a sudden that I've killed a policeman, cut the body up into pieces and put it in this orchard. And a set of poems began in this kind of form that came from this. And this is, I would say, the winter of 2010, I guess. And the poems used the stanza almost to create these kind of contained explosions. And more than James's style, it was these stanzas that I really loved that seemed to me like wonderful little kind of contained explosions. And so I had been looking for a way to... My mother died in the spring of 2008. And after she died, I wrote a bunch of bad narrative poems that sounded like California Robert Frost. And at the end of each of them, there was a moral, that was a motto. There was a character who was in vague peril, who came out at the end with some kind of pithy saying. I was very unsatisfied with these poems. I had been looking for a good way to write about this. And I started writing these poems about this recurring dream. And it's interesting because actually that dream doesn't make it into the book. That poem doesn't make it into the book. But that started me writing the poems that became the accounts. And I sort of decided I wanted to try to write, actually, though, about some of the things that happened to my family during that time. And one of the things that happened to us was that we brought my mother home, and she was in hospice care for about a week. And this is probably an experience some of you have had. If you haven't had this experience, an experience you might actually have in your lives. And it was very vivid. It was like being alive twice, as the poet Linda Gregg would say. It was like life magnified. Things became slow and big. And so in the difficulty of trying to write about this emotionally difficult thing, I decided what I could do is limit it in time and space. And so I gave myself this rule that I could only write poems about this 4 or 5 day period right around the death. And they became the narrative poems that form the middle section of the book, the accounts. And the rest of the book kind of burgeoned out from there. But what was very true about the accounts was very quickly I saw the shape of the book as a book. I sensed that it would have 3 sections. I sensed that there would be a middle section that had to do with really, in a way, personal information. That it almost had to be almost a little bit like a screenplay, in a way. So almost all the writing from that took place after the writing from Permission. But what was really true was during this time, I had the manuscript from Permission that I was taking things out of and putting things back into, and taking things out of and putting things back into. And I had like a 110-page version of Permission. And that manuscript, that book, was to me a lot like the Ship of Theseus. You guys heard of the Ship of Theseus, right? It's this Greek story about there's a ship, and it keeps getting repaired, right? So you have to replace the prow, and you have to replace the sail, and all these things. And after you replace everything, is it still the Ship of Theseus, right? So I think of Permission as the Ship of Theseus-like manuscript, where by the time I finished it, nothing in it was what it was originally, and yet it had some spirit of its own original shape, which kept me from kind of smashing the 2 things together. So to me, what was kind of interesting was I had a manuscript of Permission. I did all of this work on the accounts, and afterwards I took this, what seemed to be about a 120-page book of Permission, and I cut it a lot. I cut like 45 pages. I cut a lot from the manuscript, and I wrote one new poem from the manuscript, and it seemed to get shape from there. Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
What do you all think? What do you want to ask?
Can I ask a quick question while you're talking about shaping manuscripts? As somebody who was, I guess, sort of shaping your second and third manuscript, sort of one of the questions a lot of poets are in the midst of trying to answer. Did you have a certain idea of where you wanted to publish, or a certain idea of publishers or contests? Was there any kind of like formal schemata that you were, I don't know, observing, or did you have a place in the home in mind as you were shaping them?
No, not at all. And the truth of the matter was that I finished my PhD in 2006, and at that time I was teaching in a little school in the California desert where I saw and talked to no poets. I barely sent my work out, and I didn't think about publication at all. That was what was going to become the Permission manuscript. For like 3 or 4 years, I just wrote poems, and I didn't think about putting them in an order. The first time I put that manuscript in an order, I think it was just shortly before my mom died. I think April in 2008. And I did so kind of tenderly and gingerly, as if it was, as if I would break the integrity of those individual things simply to put it together. And I don't know, I think that I had a sense that I wanted to have books, but I loved so much being in the writing of those poems at the time. And the poems I'm thinking about are the poems in the middle section of the second book, Permission. They all have the title Strange Litany. And when I think about happy writing times in my life, I think about the writing of those poems was this totally joyful, it was like this notebook between me, the desert, silence, my friends, and God. And the last thing I wanted to think about was what that would look like when it got published. I just wanted it to be its own experience. When I finished the accounts, I had a sense that the book had a foothold in the history of poetry and was in conversation with the history of poetry in the way that my first two books were not. And that was kind of, in a way, kind of very clear to me. And I didn't think of Chicago as a place for the book, but a good friend of mine did and saw what I saw in it. So what she saw confirmed what I saw, and I was simply just very lucky and very fortunate that she had the ear of one of the editors there. And so it all went forward that way. But it may hearten you to know that while that was happening, I also sent it to another press. And this other press, I'm not going to name the press, but you can guess. The other press sent me back a letter with all the titles of the poems, and it almost is the manuscript that got published, and said that they liked the manuscript, but they didn't find everything in it as strong as the second section. They recommended in the letter that I go back to the hospital where my mother had her cancer treatment and try to write some poems in the hospital again after the fact. And they went through all the poems on this sheet, and they put next to them a plus or a minus or a check, sometimes a check plus.
University of Pittsburgh, is that right?
No. And I think this was well-meaning. I mean, I think there was something in the, look, it's all well-meaning, isn't it? There was something in it they liked, right?
Yeah.
But, so I did what a dutiful student does, which is, I took their advice to heart and I came up with another version of the manuscript. And I sent it to them. And at the same time, I sent my version to Chicago. And Chicago took it. They wrote me back in a month. I was just astonished, right? And then I got a letter from this other press telling me that after I made all their changes, that it wasn't, they actually thought it was weaker than the first one. And so there are the two lessons that I learned from this. Is this interesting to you at all? Okay. There are the two lessons that I learned from this. The first one was that it doesn't hurt your book to come up with different versions of it. It doesn't do anything to you should come up with 10 versions of it, right? It doesn't mean you're going to like them all equally, but it didn't confuse me to do that. I still had my version, It was kind of like, let's put it up the flagpole and see if they salute it, right? What's going to happen, right? And if they had taken it, I was fortunate because Chicago took the book that I wanted, so it was solved for me. But I think I could have fixed it in a way. Like, if I had felt badly about it, I think I would have figured that out, And the second, the second thing about it is that even smart people who do a really careful reading of your work, sometimes they want something from it that it's not going to give them. And I could see that this press, they wanted something from the work they wanted a couple of particular things from the work that it wasn't going to give them. I suspect that they thought it was too thinky, actually. They thought it had too much thought in it and not enough story, not enough image. And, that was, in a way, a good thing for me to know because it enabled me to embrace the things that it was, right? You can only do the thing you can do, in a way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I know my answer at the end kind of collapsed, but
No, that's great.
it was really fun to get their rejection letter after I sent and part of the acceptance letter.
Put it up on the screen.
Yeah.
I don't want to eclipse anyone else. Okay. That's great to hear you describe this, because Corey and I have been talking about this book, which we love. And we both found it kind of surprising that there's something kind of uncompromising and difficult about some of the early poems. And I like how they're not dressy, how there's something really, really strong in these lean statements. You really have to ponder. We were looking at elegy over and over, and the preference for judgment over, like, whose judgment is that? And it kind of worked both ways. We go into this dialogue. But that's a risky thing to do. And some of it clicks into focus when you get into the second, because then the window comes back, the sense of the garden, the mother's attachment to the garden, and the sense of division comes back, the nest comes back, and these things gain another. It's like the poems, the early poems become new again. We read them with a greater depth. But that, I like the fact that it's thinky and also incredibly emotional. And it almost seems like that they're related to me.
Yeah.
Like some of the difficulty is an emotional difficulty and an intellectual. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so did you wonder about putting the second section first? Did you wonder about that experience? Of course, the first section has more transparency, but after that, there's some, more difficult poems. Did you wonder about that, the entry and kind of a caution? Because oftentimes we tell, students to front load manuscripts, so that's how they get read, the first couple of poems.
Yeah. I think the first poem or the first couple of poems of a manuscript is a really crucial moment, and it's a hard moment to make a decision about.
Yeah.
And I did get a lot of advice about how the whole book should be like the second section, or the whole book should be the second section. That in a way, I sometimes got the advice that the second section should be first, and I sometimes got the advice that the second section should be pulled out and distributed throughout the manuscript. So that narrative, that contained narrative world of yard and garden and nest could kind of happen. But as you were speaking, I think I figured out the reason why I didn't want to do that. And what I'd always thought as a poet, and I said this in my interview with Jess, is that description is like where it's at. I've loved the great describers. I think about someone like John Clare, or right now I think Joanna Klink is this amazing describer of sensation, sensory perception, and people who can just Virginia Woolf, these descriptions. But what I've always thought was that if you can really nestle yourself in description, it will lend itself to true judgments, or judgments that have some traction or credibility. And I think the reason why I didn't put the second section first is because, in a way, what mourning taught me was the opposite, is that sometimes you have to judge badly or well your way back into description. You have to get back into the world. And in a way, I think part of what happens in the book is that what the first section enacts are these statements, these like philosophizings that are true, if they're true at all, only for the length of the line.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what does it mean to say that, what is it? Judgment is preferable to
faithfulness.
A pair of handcuffs better than a ring. What does this person mean by this?
Yeah.
Whatever the speaker means, the speaker only means it for an instant.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about that rumination where what the book is trying to say, I think, is it will get you back into this world. In order to get back into the world of memory, there's a dare you must take. Yeah.
Yeah, that signals something very emotional, even though it's cast as a very discursive statement.
Mm-hmm.
But so in that sense, it's wedded to its moment, to this sense of betrayal and bitterness, and I'm going to refuse the traditional consolations and the myth that you bring in.
Can you talk either about, were there any poems or a poem that sort of emerged as your favorite, or maybe like an underdog poem? Or I'm interested in that you said the first couple of collections you felt like didn't engage with sort of a historical sense and were maybe after something else. So I'm curious, what the other thing was.
Yeah. Let me sort of back into the first question is easier. So I think what I meant by that was, so in the second book, Permission, I did a huge amount of editing on punctuation and commas, colons, and on certain rhymes in the middle of the line. And the music of that book, if it's akin to anything, it's akin to remnants of madrigal and ballad and someone like Lorene Niederker. It has this kind of, to me, that's what I was reading at the time. So it has this minimalist ear, but the short lines have something to do with that as well. And it seemed to me, Dickinson, I guess, is also behind that, I suppose. I just finished writing my dissertation. But that all seemed to me so homemade at the time, I think, because I wasn't talking to a lot of the poets in a way. And the thing about the accounts was, I felt like I really let myself have my big thoughts in that book, and they needed form. So not only did they need the elegy, they also needed the stanza They needed metaphor in a certain way. They needed other structures. And I'm not sure what the other thing is, but I had a sense from early on, from wanting to put a poem where I mentioned King Lear in the front of the manuscript, right in front of the book, that it had something to do with what it feels like to write poetry after a huge tradition, right? And also kind of after like postmodernism's blown up this huge tradition, which is the place we're all writing from right now. I mean, this isn't, it's not Emily Dickinson's time when people memorized poems in school, and it's not the 1950s when there was a slate of things everybody read. There's not a slate of things everyone reads. So every time you mention literature in a poem, it's like, oh my God, what's happening right now? And so I think that's what I mean. And I think I felt more confident, more organically engaging with learning in the poems in a way. And so I think when I started reading from the book, my favorite poems to read were and still are Spring and Eulogy. And The Dark Horses are everything in the last section, which at this point is totally my favorite, like confession and argument about responsibility. And the last poem in the book, Snake, was just a notebook thing. Whenever I read it, I think about its humble beginnings as just this scribbling in a notebook about this snake that ended up in my house in the desert. And so I have a kind of, whenever I read that poem, the composition of place comes into my brain, and I feel a sense of confidence because I can be back in that place again. Yeah.
Since we're talking about reading
Yeah.
and literature, and there are so many undergraduates here who are doing that right now,
Yeah.
I wondered if you would mind just mentioning a couple things, that really stick out that you read, maybe even early on or just yesterday, that really have had an impact.
Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is the first novel I ever loved. And it's one of these things that just gets better as you get older. And, you make more mistakes. And you go back. The Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche is a book that, I teach it every chance I get, and if you haven't read it, just go get it. Read it with your crazy best friend, and meet them at midnight in some cemetery and talk to them about it. And it's just you got to read it. It's amazing. The Odyssey is a huge book for me. It's still a huge book for me that I really like to teach. The Poems of Emily Dickinson, Middlemarch by George Eliot, anything that's a 19th century novel, all of Thomas Hardy. I know people say he's really depressing. I know that's what people say. It's not true. Don't believe them. Don't believe them. Go read the books. The thing about Thomas Hardy is his characters they have ambition, and he never judges them for it. He never says, you shouldn't want to go to school, or you shouldn't want to marry that guy, or anything like that. There are narrative consequences, but the narrative voice never does that. And what he's describing is a natural world that's being lost. And even though that's not where we're at in the 21st century, this sense that you feel this fear about your world perishing, I don't know whether you guys ever feel like this in this world right now. Hardy gets that. So, him too. I'm trying to think, is that enough?
I don't know. I think it's it down.
Yeah. I just read Teju Cole's Every Day is for the Thief, I think is the name of it. I love Teju Cole. I liked his other book too, contemporary Nigerian writer. There's someone with a question over here.
Have you read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies?
Yes. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
I have a question about one of the poems. Well, actually, let me say, one of my favorite things about the book was this series of argument poems that goes through the book. I think part of what I like about them is just the brazenness of that title. Kind of just in that, arguments don't have to be resolved. So it kind of tells us at the beginning that we're not necessarily going to look for a resolve, but we're just going to look at what it is to argue about something. So I like that. And I was wondering about argument about silence. Because of the way the lines work with that silence between each line, but then the way you can read it every other line, starting first, third, fifth, and second, fourth, sixth. And I was wondering if you could talk about, how you came up with the poem, and also how does your ideal reader read the poem?
So that's the one with the snake at the end of it?
Yes, the two-headed snake. Yeah.
Okay. So how did I come up with the idea for this poem? I'm going to say this again tonight, but the reason why they're called arguments is because they have two sides. But they're not necessarily sides of the same argument. Okay? So what I was sort of interested in doing on the one hand, and a poem like Argument About Heaven is much clearer in this pursuit, is telling a story on the one hand, and on the other hand, making a series of judgments. And what was cut out was the middle. There's one voice usually in those poems that's very cold, and there's one that's very hot. It's like superego and id, and it's missing ego. It's missing the thing that will keep it not off kilter in a way. And I've done it at readings before when the poems were sort of in process, where I had a friend of mine and we read alternately. I never liked that. When I read it, what I try to do is put myself in a headspace where there are two poems, and I have to just alternate between the two poems, essentially. And so I'm reading it as if I'm reading you two poems. And so one poem is the silence of one poem is the silence of the other poem, essentially, the negative space of the other poem. What's interesting about that, as I've tried to learn to read the poems, which I'm altogether not sure I do well, is there then has to be even more silence in between in order to make that even a little bit clearer. Some of the early poems, the two strands, the poems of the first section, I think the two strands seem more different, but in the poem you mentioned, Argument About Silence, that's one of the first ones that I discovered it didn't matter. I didn't have to, when I first started writing them, I was trying to write two intact sentences that were interspersed with each other as two different poems. And they had to be one sentence with no breaks and another sentence with no breaks. Do you get what I'm saying? Like one long sentence and another long sentence interspersed. Okay, this is a lot of rules, right? So I told myself I had to write two different poems. One of them had to be thinky, one of them had to be hot. They both had to be one intact sentence. And this was like my set of constraints. I mean, this is kind of insane. And so I did 2 or 3 of these. And of course, whenever you create a straitjacket, you find out how to get yourself out of it. And I just started finding the ways in which I could play with it and not make it totally coherent. And what I discovered was there was so much over-coherence, like obsessive coherence in my thoughts, that a little bit of incoherence in those poems actually makes them a little bit better, you know. But I think I only get away, in a way I get away with that because my level of conviction and certainty is like obnoxious sometimes in these poems. And so that poem that you're mentioning is, you know, it's funny. I think a lot of the earlier ones are much more solitary, and that one is about there's one account of a conversation happening, and then there's another account of this story. And what's distinctive about that poem is that the hot voice comes first, and the cold one comes second, and often it's the other way around. And I'll just say a word about the biographical circumstances of what's happening in the poem, just because it may be fun for you to know them. So my mother died, and then my father started seeing somebody who's now married to, and they planned to get married about a year after my mother died, and there was this huge Monterey pine tree in the backyard of the house where I was raised, and about a month before the wedding, the tree split in half and fell on the house. It was like Bronte stuff, you know? And it was kind of great because there's like a ready-made symbol in a way there for you. And this split tree made all these other things go off in my head, like the two-headed snake, all of these twos seemed to kind of come together, and that's part of where the poem came from. Yeah. You don't have to go hunting for symbols in this life. They come find you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could you also maybe speak about, I know one of the animating tensions or currents in the book is the personal narrative and how you show in and out of that. I also noticed that there's, I guess, elements of the historical that seem to be crafted or add to the poem. Like there's that 18th century cat harpsichord, the 19th century field guide, an island that loses its ability to make pottery. I'm just wondering, I guess you have some kind of like formal pattern to that, or is that more of an organic process, or do you have like a reading habit that allows you to weave these into the pattern?
Well, I think that I live like 70% of my intellectual life in the 19th century and the 18th century, in a combination between certain kinds of Enlightenment philosophy and certain forms of poetry and novels from the 19th century. And so the facts get in through that, in a way. I think that's where they come from. And I'm struck by the fact that as I hear you talk about these facts, I realize they're all in the first section. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, there was this preoccupation in the first section with using any piece of data as something that could potentially order the subject, right? I mean, this is the desperation of the mourner, you know. It's that kind of superstition. It's like looking for any port in a storm, right? And any fact, right? The fact that this 18th century guy could make a harpsichord out of cattails, it must mean something, right? And then, of course, it just simply doesn't. You know, like the point of that poem is like, the singer can't sing. When I eat, it hurts. And about personal experience, I'll say that personal experience is a question, not an answer in poetry, right? And the ghost of its insignificance is always there for me. It doesn't mean that it's not significant. I don't understand how you could write poetry without your experiences. I think that poetry that's too tethered to concepts is pretty dull. And experience has all of this feeling about it of mistake and of kind of consciousness as it kind of skips from stone to stone of all the stuff that happens to you that's just significant to you. Like, how do you make it significant to other people? But the accounts made me sort of hyper aware of how that could be joined to a greater collective problem in a way, because this personal event had kind of not just ruptured me, but it kind of ruptured my sense of what it meant to make a world. And so everything that felt like a personal feeling sort of immediately seemed to become a conceptual reading of the world, a judgment that could be made. And so it was very confusing. Yeah. And if my best friend Sandra was here, she would say, "Oh, that's just Katie. She needs to use her big concepts to understand the world because she's a Sagittarius." And her point is, I'm the daughter of a lawyer. I'm the granddaughter of a judge, and in a way, I see that in myself in that book when it's brought to my attention that my voice, when it's trying to sort of give a conceptual understanding to things, is its most vulnerable. I like to do that not because I think I have all the answers, but because in overreaching, in trying to be too certain, I sometimes get somewhere with the rest of the stuff in poetry. I mean, the stuff that happens here in your head, not in the world of personal experience too, right? Yeah.
How do you think the organization of poems affects what your audience gets out of it? Because you said that when you write each individual poem, you're not thinking, at least part of the time, you're not thinking about actually getting that poem published or anything. So I'm assuming you're kind of writing it for yourself as the audience. So then when you take these poems and then when you compile them into a collection and you think about the organization of these poems, how they should be divided into sections, which poems should maybe be included or omitted, people begin to make connections between each poem, maybe thinking about an overarching theme or something. So how do you think that the organization of each individual poem into your collection affects what the audience gets out of the overall collection?
Oh, this is a question about thinking about the reader. Do you think about the reader? I'm always uncomfortable saying yes to the statement, you must be writing poems for yourself, because number one, I'm not even sure I am a self or have a self. I mean, I don't know from one minute to the next who I am in some sense. And because there seems, I think, when you're writing poetry to be some other presence there. Whether that's a ghost or an intuition of an anonymous stranger, which is, I think, what it was for Emily Dickinson, and sometimes I think that's what it feels like for me. Whether or not it's some idea of God, whether or not it's simply just some hypothesis or fantasy that someone else might listen. It still exists, even if it can't be named and it's not the public. I think the difference between poetry maybe and other art forms isn't not thinking about the reader, but that in a play your audience is present, and in the novel it seems like you're telling a story about everybody, so they all are imaginable as your reader. But for poetry, it's as if the audience is the unimaginable and unaccounted for part of you in culture or something. So it's much harder to think about. When people, interpret a book and they see patterns in it, some of those are patterns that I wished for them to see. I wished for someone to see, I wished to put there. And some of them are things I never could have imagined. It's a combination of both of those things, because the process remains really mysterious. And so some of the things in the book are really clear, like this nest in the middle, and wanting you to see that, wanting a reader to see that, seems native to my sense of composition. But other things, like one of the things we've been talking about a little in the last couple questions is tone, which is so hard to describe in poetry. I mean, I think a lot of poets don't even know the tone of something as they go to put it on the page. If they knew what the tone was, they wouldn't need to have it. Tone is the spontaneous thing that just kind of happens when you start writing. So it's sort of like 50-50, right? Like half of it is stuff that you, I think, sort of know or intuit is there, and half of it you never could have even imagined. I was just looking today on the airplane at one of the poems in the collection called Gods, and it's in the third section, and it's a poem I wrote about, I was in the middle of breaking up with someone, and I really liked his parents, and I knew they didn't know, and that they were like 45 minutes away from me, and I thought about them all the time. I thought, the news hasn't reached them yet, and I felt so sad that my acquaintance with them was going to be ended. And I read that poem today, and I realized it almost sounds like the person who's speaking the poem is dying. The news that hasn't reached the people is that person is gone. And I certainly didn't think of the poem as being about that. I thought of it as being about something highly biographical. But it's interesting how when you go to make a poem out of something autobiographical, much of what was in it seems to disappear, seems to become irrelevant to the poem as it's being written. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So when you were ending your self-exile and your silence from the polkas, who did you talk to, and what did you want to talk about, and what did you want to hear?
When I was ending it?
Yeah.
Like when I came out of it? Well, I got really interested in classic rock. And I talked a lot for a couple of summers about Keith Richards with my brother and my sister, who are also big Rolling Stones fans. That was a big deal for me because I hadn't ever really been that much of a classic rock kind of person. I was at the time teaching a class at Deep Springs, the college where I used to teach. It's a 2-year school for men that also operates as a ranch, on feminism. And it was the first feminism class the school had ever had. And I was reading a lot of great books like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and really classic, Mary Wollstonecraft, really classic texts about the difference between men and women. And that topic got me I got really interested in that again. And also, after my mother died, I got really interested in that again, and how we think about those differences. And at Deep Springs, and since then, I have and I do read a lot of philosophy. And I don't really read analytic philosophy. I read like the Greeks, and I've been working on this long poem, which is like an 80-page love letter to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I don't think we'll ever see the light of day, but I sort of accepted philosophy into my life, not as my personal savior, but as a real touchstone of something that I found really useful to think about. And mainly I wanted to talk about it not with philosophers, but with other people like myself, meaning poets, random lay people, like people I met at church, like about like because what I found. Are there any philosophers here? I want to. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that like people who are studying it and grad students, that was great. I didn't want to talk to any philosophy professors about philosophy, is the thing I'm trying to say. I wanted to talk to people who were trying to understand it because they were trying to answer a kind of question of soul. And that was really important to me. There was some sense of negotiations with ideas on some level that was significant. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry, you said love letter to Rousseau?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. I just had a lot of students read Rousseau, and I think right now I can hear they're asking, but why do you love Rousseau? I'm not sure. Yes.
Okay, Rousseau had this, idea about human nature, right? It was that people are good, and that culture comes along and corrupts them. And in a way, I think, you see some vestige of this in a character like that guy in Into the Wild, right? This notion that if you could just get back into the garden, everything would be okay. This is all a huge error, right? I think it's the most beautiful error I can think of in the history of thought. Like, I don't think he's right? I don't find his ideas particularly sympathetic, but in a way, a lot of the things that come out of this, for example, like, people live in families because they have to, not because it's natural, right? Like, the nature of a person is to submit or resist. Like, that's our spiritual core, whether or not we submit or resist. So our freedom is at the core of who we are. And these are to me like two really insightful, kind of, again, maybe wrong, but interesting ideas about humans and human nature. And also because his life was so messy. It's so the opposite of someone living the American dream. He's not even living the 18th century French dream. Like everything he did besides philosophy, he did badly. And sometimes I feel like everything I do except poetry, I do badly. So, yeah.
Can I go back to how you don't talk to philosophy professors? I think that's really interesting. But I think I get that completely. I majored in philosophy, but maybe as you, I took up a level classes, and it was like you were talking about mathematics. You have that math friend who you ask him to explain something that's really fascinating, but soon he gets off into astrophysics, it seems like, or he's talking in Greek and Latin. Most things it really is. But so is that it, or is it something else? Is it like a disconnect in a different way? Is it a disconnect in language? And I guess it's a two-part question. And maybe this is a stupid question, but do you see poetry and creative writing as the translation of that examination of the soul back into culture?
Oh, those are beautiful questions. As for the first one, sometimes philosophy and there's a way in which philosophy sometimes wants to pursue its own integrity before it wants to pursue what might actually be true. So George Oppen, the American poet, takes Heidegger out of context. He's not totally true to what Heidegger meant, right? That's not what's important in a way. What's important is that the poem kind of has something to do with Heidegger's notion of being contingent, meaning sort of radically haphazard in the 20th century. And when Oppen goes to take those ideas, he talks about things like, poor people in the streets of New York and people sitting at windows, doing nothing, and unemployed people and broken cars and all this stuff. And there's something about having read Heidegger that gives Oppen even more access to a form that makes all these things seem as haphazard as Heidegger sort of acts like they are in his notion of being, right? To me, this is a lot more interesting than, whether or not Heidegger was internally consistent. I could probably care less in a way. What was your second question?
What was my second question? Yeah. Do you see poetry and creative writing as kind of the translation of, I guess philosophy's roots about, as you were talking about, the examination of the soul or the conversation of other things back into the culture?
Yeah, we have humanity on our side, right? We have to put it in bodies. I think that there are a lot of poets who I think of as members of the American avant-garde who I really like to read, but there are certain assumptions in, for example, conceptualist poetry that aren't interesting to me, because part of what's really interesting to me about poetry is it's always a voice, and a voice implies some relationship with a body and some relationship with a person, right? And so you can have all the internally consistent Heideggerian ideas you want. You know, you could have read all of Plato and memorized it, but as soon as you're dealing with a problem like, you know, falling out of love with somebody, that's only going to be so helpful to you. And if you have a choice between your own judgment and some philosophers, well, you might well choose your own in that case, in a way, right? So I think that the thing about poetry is it just puts all those things back. You're right. I think you're right. It puts all those things kind of back into the world. It makes them human. It puts them back into our lives, I guess. Yeah. It's a way of getting out of your head. That's the thing I'm trying to say. That's the more clear way of saying what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I feel like I write poems to get out of my head. Yeah.
It's interesting, I mean, this whole conversation, because although I see that impulse in you, it's always a conflicted one.
Yeah.
You know, that you're going, the one on responsibility is a good case in point, because, I mean, this dialogue between recklessness and law that you've articulated there, you can see the certain ways that your logic works is often just a craving for paradox, and a craving for disruption, just as you're about to, I mean, I'm thinking of this move, a child never understands what a parent goes through to make a pattern. Since I didn't keep it silent, it's the least they can do. Okay, well, that's a kind of brain freeze moment. Like, it's the least they can, you know what I'm saying? That there's something vigorously difficult and paradoxical about that statement. Yeah. And I see, so in terms of this connection to philosophy, I mean, there's certain philosophy that obviously, you know, it appreciates the role of irrationality, but it's often framed, you know, in such a way that's rational. Yeah. So in terms of embodiment, there's another way of looking at it, that you're actually enacting, you know, certain things that happen after. That's part of the conscience of poetry, is that it says, why does it matter? You know, being in a body, yes, but being in a heart, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Being in a moment. So, it's never that's. I see you as being very much in your head at the same time that you're everywhere else. Yeah. And that's part of what I love about the work. Yeah. I mean, do you ever conceive of it? I mean, you do. I love philosophy. Yeah. But I love arguing with it. Yeah. And disrupting it. And it seems like you do too.
Yeah. Let me rephrase the thing I said. I feel like I should want to get out of my head. Yeah. Right. Because that's what everyone else tells me I should want. Right. I mean, that's why you write poetry and do yoga and whatever, and do all these things. Like, that's why you go to nature. That's why it's to get out of your head, man. Like, that's the whole point. I feel like all my life people have been telling me that I should get out of my head more. So I feel some kind of an elemental should, like an obligation to that. Yeah, I do. But I also think that the mind can show us possibilities that the world has eclipsed, right? So there are certain things that aren't socially acceptable, like telling your parents that it's the least they can do to form a pattern for you.
But poetry keeps encouraging us to see the way out is in. Mm-hmm. So it's supremely confusing. I mean, I'm wondering what you think about empathy in poetry. Mm-hmm. If that is a tension that's operative in you, it seems like it is. Or in Oppen, being numerous, it's also the social self. Yeah. So that and the role of the imagination in empathy is really interesting to me, because it's the thing that eclipses you from other people, but also connects you. Right? Mm-hmm. You can't have empathy without it, but you can be totally in your own dream.
Right. That's funny. I wrote down empath. Just exactly. You just said that. Yeah.
Well, but in all of what you're talking about too, you're talking about what it means to have an interior, right? This thing about trying to figure out if it's still possible to have an interior and what an interior might look like.
It's never as discreet as Eliot thought. It's always messier.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if your interior takes you through other people's ideas or takes you into some thinking that feels so thinky, that's an abstract. Sometimes your interior can land you in some weird, brutal abstractions too. So it can land you in paradoxes. It's not as if your interior is a safe and protected place, right? Yeah.
How about one last question?
Okay.
Okay, one last question. Somebody, please.
I have one.
I can answer both of them.
Okay, go for it.
Okay.
Okay, I have a question about writing biographical poems.
Yeah.
Do you ever lie about something that was biographical and then a friend or a family says, well, that's not how it happened? Family member? And then, so the second part of this question is, does the fear of that situation or the fear of the truth ever prevent you from writing something?
This is a great question. So when my first book was published, there's a poem in it where my mother is asleep. And I was having dinner with my parents, and my mother said to me, she said, Kate, you know that poem where I'm asleep? And I said, yes. And she said, well, I wasn't asleep in that poem. So this is my mother for you. But as for the second thing, which is, first of all, what's going to happen when people who know the stories call you out on them? And do you have any fears about that? While I'm writing, I have no fears about that. And I have no problem lying. What happens, happens. It's a battlefield, right? So it's all by necessity. There's some kind of confidence that's within the poem because the poem is more important than me or the truth. When it comes to life, it's been interesting to me to experience the tensions and conversations I've had with my family as a result of writing this book, most of which have been very, very positive, actually. But it's sort of, sometimes people do remember things quite differently than, the thing I was most afraid of was that my father wouldn't remember that he wrote the eulogy before my mother actually died. But he remembers it the way I did. And that, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I didn't have a specific question, but just thinking about this polemic, the argument that she mentioned, taking two sides, and then what Bruce just mentioned, and then realizing you talk a lot about birth in this book,
Yeah.
even as you talk about death.
Yes.
You're talking about conception, your own conception, kind of remembering or imagining how you might have been brought into this world, literally, physically, but even at that moment of conception, the waters were swirling, the Mobius, and then also all the images of the branches blooming, and so that too is kind of the other side of that, and maybe the hope side for you to come through that experience.
Yeah.
So, just thinking of that.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you.